So my story starts in a dimly lit basement classroom at the college that I went to for my undergraduate degree. This was the college where a couple weeks earlier I had gone to the school's chaplain to ask for help because I've been having a lot of anxiety for months, honestly really years, and it just wasn't going away. And his response was to tell me that there was probably something I hadn't asked for forgiveness yet that was weighing on me. In addition, I had been seeing a male therapist in training at the school's counseling center. And I told him a story about something that had happened when I was in high school that was still bothering me, about a boyfriend who had crossed my boundaries physically. And the therapist was pretty dismissive and told me it really wasn't a big deal. So I'm in this basement classroom at an information center about volunteering for a rape crisis phone line. And we get to the part of the training where they start describing things that we might hear when people call in. And all of a sudden, I start to feel this full body rage that I can't remember ever feeling before. It started in my core and rose up to my head. I was feeling nauseous, I was hot, I was shaking, and my brain became very foggy. I couldn't figure out why. I was going to school to be a social worker. I heard bad stories all the time. And as far as I could remember, I had never been sexually assaulted. But unfortunately, that rage and that full body feeling stayed with me for days, and I ended up not being able to volunteer. Fast forward a couple of decades, and now I'm walking down a hallway on the 4th floor of a building that is really well lit to my office in Survivor Support Services, where I work full-time as a therapist, providing support to students who have experienced interpersonal violence, which of course includes a lot of sexual assault. And I'm here willingly. I'm very happy. This is one of the best jobs I've ever had. This particular day, as I'm walking down the hall to my office and to the survivor support space, there are 2 groups of people standing on either side of the hallway. They're dressed much more professionally than most of the people who work in this hallway. A couple of them are holding clipboards, and they look very happy. But something felt really off to me, so I did not return their smiles. About an hour or so later, I'm in the middle of my first therapy session for the day, and the student and I start to hear a lot of noise outside of my office. This is really unusual because usually once I put up the in-session sign, people respect that. But not only were we hearing a lot of noise, we started seeing shadows right outside the tinted window on the door, and it even looked like somebody was trying to peer in the window. When the session was over, we walked out of the door and saw that group of professionally dressed people with clipboards that had been in the hallway. And this is how I found out that we were being kicked out of our space. The president of the university had decided that there was a building on campus that he wanted to move into with his staff. And so he was kicking the staff, the administrative staff, out of that building and putting them in our space. And we had to move out by the end of the semester. We didn't have anywhere to go, but we still had to move out. If you know anything about working at a university, there's a lot of bureaucracy, so even though we had nowhere to go and we were protesting, we still started packing up our stuff and eventually had to move out into a temporary space. During this time that we were packing up, trying to fight this, the move-out date actually kept creeping up earlier. So it went from the end of the semester to December 1st to a Friday where most of the university had been encouraged to leave early or work from home because there was a football game that day and they needed the parking. We were informed that morning that we had to be out by Monday. And I felt that rage building up in me over those few days between when we found out and when we were told we had to be out by Monday. And because I'm a person who still very much physically expresses my emotions, I was actually getting sick. And I started to wonder if I was maybe overreacting. Like, it was just an office, and I hadn't even worked there that long. It had only been a couple of months. But then I remembered that the journey from that dimly lit basement to the 4th floor and survivor support services had been paved by safe, predictable, stable spaces. When I eventually started having flashbacks about the sexual assault that did in fact happen to me when I was a child, it was therapists in their offices on a weekly, sometimes twice weekly basis who kept me going and helped me heal enough so that I can now be a person who helps to provide safe spaces. And I often wonder, what would my life have been like if in my undergraduate years, instead of the chaplain and the therapist, I had had a place like survivor support, a place that was hidden and safe and locked. We don't even have a sign on our door telling people where we are. A place where I knew that any of the staff who opened the door would have welcomed me, believed me, invited me to have tea and coffee, let me play with the tiny emotional support dog who looks pretty unassuming but really jumps into action when you start crying. What would my life have been like if I had had that at a much earlier stage of my life? So we did end up moving into a temporary space. This space was on the 1st floor of a building. It seemed to be made entirely of windows, and it was very noisy. And we didn't really have a place for students to wait for their appointments, so they ended up standing outside of the door in a very heavily trafficked area of the campus. I heard from several students that they ran into their classmates while they were waiting, and their classmates were asking invasive questions. And it was while we were here that we found out some more information, which was that the reason the president had initiated this move was for safety, for his safety. He wanted a place where he could lock the doors and control who was coming and going, kind of like what we've been trying to do with survivor support. And so we had found out about all of this the day after the 2024 presidential election. And so we couldn't have written the metaphor better ourselves. Another man in power was concerned about his safety, and as a result, had displaced and caused a bunch of marginalized people to be very unsafe. Fortunately for us, though, these particular marginalized people actually had a lot of power in this situation. When the student government found out what was happening, they really sprang into action. They started posting things on social media, they contacted our employee union, and within a week they were able to schedule a town hall with 2 of the provosts who were part of this move. And so, approximately almost 2 weeks after we had first been told that we had to move out, there was a huge town hall on campus. There were 2 of the older white men in power sitting on the stage, and then something really incredible happened. Students came forward and stood in front of their peers and in front of these men and told stories that they had only ever told within the walls of survivor support. Some of them even turned and looked at the men and demanded answers. That's not something I could have ever done. And what happened next was something that I didn't think I would ever see in my career, which is that the men in power listened, they validated, they admitted their mistake, and then they reversed it. So the evening of the day when we had really, I think that morning, just wheeled our last box into the temporary space, we were told we could move back into survivor support. So of course we did the very next day. And as a result of all the encouragement and enthusiasm that we received during this whole move, I feel like we've really been energized to do more. I've been told a couple of times that at some point the walls of my small office are gonna get knocked down because the space next to me is not being used and I'm gonna get a bigger office. That would not have happened before. We're literally knocking down walls now. And Lewis mentioned that this is a call to action. So I want to be really obvious with it here. What happened in this particular story is what needs to happen to help stop the endemic of sexual assault in our country. Almost, if not every woman that I know has been sexually assaulted multiple times in their life. And what usually happens when they tell their story is what happened to me. They're dismissed, they're not believed, they're often blamed, and their privacy continues to be invaded. But what happened with the safe space of survivor support is the opposite of that, and we saw what got done. And those students whose stories were heard and acted on have been empowered. There was a lot of healing that happened that night. And I think that this is something that we can continue to do on a smaller scale, on a day-to-day basis. So if someone talks to you about their experience of being a survivor, the best thing you can do is listen and believe them. Thank you.